well, we are at risk. It's been a subject of debate, especially among many environmentalists who are concerned about the health as well as the effect it has on the environment, on the end users. And we're all interested in getting access to use electronic products. But at the end of the day, they tend to generate a lot of waste and coin into a phrase known around the world as e-waste. We're here to do a lot more discussions on the subject. We know also that our reporters, not only in Ghana but across the continent, have undertaken or compiled a lot of reports on this very subject, because it's a gaining phenomenon that many non-governmental agencies as well as international organizations are looking at. We're here just to look at this very subject importantly because there's a gentleman in the studio. He's a research person but also a lecturer with Lancaster University, UK. But more importantly, has worked with various organizations. The UN Environment Program has worked also for the UN, the UK Environment Department, DIFRA, as known in many respects for many of you associated with it, but also concerned with the subject of electronic waste. He's here in Ghana to look at that very subject, and we know the hub of it is in Agbogbloshie. Dr. Andy Sweetman, thanks for joining me this morning.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I want to call you Andy, is that okay?
Andy's absolutely fine.
Okay, good. And as far as we're concerned, is it a big issue? I know for us here it is, but where we get a lot more of the user appliances from the UK, the rest of Europe, the US, Asia, etc. Is it a big issue, the subject of e-waste?
I think the issue of waste globally obviously can have very local environmental impact. But I think the issue of waste globally is very important. We are in Europe trying to develop policies where if you're a retailer, you're selling electronic goods to a consumer, that there is then an obligation to take the waste back and then recycle it. But I guess most people's attitude is that once they've perhaps passed that equipment back, then they don't really know what happens to it. And that has resulted in, particularly, it's an economic driver, but particularly finding ways of recycling waste or disposing of waste, has resulted in a global, you could call it trade, but certainly a global movement of waste. So a lot of waste, electronic waste that's been produced in Europe over the last 10, 20 years has been shipped to areas of the world like southern China and also Western Africa. And Ghana has one of the largest repositories of the waste. But it's not just waste, it's also usable electronic equipment. So as you know, particularly in developed countries, there's always the latest computer, there's always the latest smartphone. So people like to change their electronic gadgets quite frequently. And that actually produces working, but what we would consider to be maybe not the latest equipment. And again, that will be shipped to countries as working computer equipment or smartphones. There is then a second-hand market for that, but then that results in the waste being produced in the country that's taking that equipment. But it's how do we deal with the waste? And some of the waste, particularly things like smartphones, contains very valuable trace metals, rare earth elements, and there is an economic value then to try and extract that. But certainly the way I've seen it being done in southern China and in Ghana, that is done in a not very environmentally responsible way. You know, it's very crude. The chemistry involved in extracting the metals is very crude. And that results in, I would say, environmental contamination in the landfill or on the centre where the recycling is being carried out. But also we have to think some of the chemicals, and this is perhaps where I'm mostly interested, some of the chemicals that are in the products are known to have hazardous properties, particularly for human health. Okay,
so what does it mean? It means that there are seepages of various chemicals from those very extractable materials from the electronic appliances seeping into liquid waste and the soils, etc., or seeping into water outlets and things like that?
It can be both. So some of there are many chemicals in these products. Perhaps the most chemicals that people will be familiar will be with the metals, but I'm particularly interested in some of the organic chemicals. Some of the chemicals I look at are actually flame retardants. So these are chemicals that are added into the products. So particularly into, say, TV casings, computer casings. And they're there in the case of an electronic fire to try and suppress the fire long enough before it maybe spreads into a house or an office. So these chemicals are present in the materials, but as they get recycled or destroyed, in the process of trying to extract valuable materials, they then can be released into the environment. They can find their way into the soil. They can then maybe find their way into water courses. But also there is then a potential, possibly through the release into air, of being exposed to the humans, the workers on the site.
Now, if, let's say now the interest for you and your research group or whoever you're working for is to find out, let's say the picture there, the gentleman picking up something, it's a young gentleman, just a child I should believe, and not in school, doing that at an incinerator or a dump, and not well protected,
yes.
Crude means of extracting the chemicals.
Yes.
It has effects on what? The health and the environment, is that it?
It does. So you mentioned that I've been working with the United Nations over many years, and also the UK Department for Environment. And some of the chemicals are added. I mentioned the flame retardants, but there are many other chemicals that have been added. When we look at those chemicals in isolation, they have been identified as being potentially toxic to humans. But also they have a negative environmental impact. They can accumulate in food chains. So you can find them in, so if the chemicals are released to a watercourse, you can find them accumulating into fish, and then again, maybe if the humans are consuming the fish, that becomes an exposure route. So these chemicals have been identified, and particularly through the United Nations Stockholm Convention, we're now looking at outright banning some of these chemicals. Now, over the last, say, 10, 20 years, that has happened. We're now adding more chemicals to the list, so we're identifying chemicals that we believe that have a negative human health impact. And it's some of these chemicals that are present in the e-waste.
Then my next logical question is, well, if nobody tends to extract them unenvironmentally, then nobody gets contaminated or gets into contact with those harmful chemicals, so to speak. So why ban them?
Well, they are released into the environment. They actually are released in the environment during product use. So just having a computer in your office or a TV set in your house.
Then you have minute emissions?
You have minute emissions, and that's something that we can measure. So most people's houses, if you've got electronic equipment, if we took a sample of air, or sometimes even the dust, we can find these chemicals. And of course that can be a human exposure pathway. You're breathing the dust in, you're breathing the air. But I think the exposure is particularly acute when you're looking at situations like this, because you're breaking the equipment apart, which increases the chance of a release. But if you're actually burning some of the waste, that actually might increase the release into the air. So my research project here has been it's a preliminary survey. I've only been here for a few days. We have taken soil samples around the dump sites.
That's Agbogbloshie?
Agbogbloshie, and we're going to take those back to the laboratory and analyse them for residues. I know that there have been only a few, but some previous studies looking at the concentrations of similar chemicals in the blood of some of the workers on the site, and that they have shown elevated levels. What we don't know, we know that these chemicals have some toxic properties, but what we don't know is whether they are going to, for sure, lead to health problems in the future of the people living on the site.
That has not been established yet?
That has not been established, and it's always very difficult to establish because these workers are exposed to a whole cocktail of different chemicals. And it's very hard then to say, well, it's one particular chemical that's likely to be causing. But what we do know is we want to try and minimise. So if there is a risk, we have to try and minimise that risk.
Okay. So you've already been to Agbogbloshie?
I have. I went on Tuesday.
So good that you've been there. But we have been there all the time, and so we'll bring you a feature put together by Solomon Jojo Kopna. It just gives you a vivid description of what really is happening at the dumping ground, the e-waste dumping ground at Agbogbloshie. That's the hub as far as we're concerned, and it's also the center for this very research by Dr. Andy Sweetman. So let's just take a look at this very report for 8 minutes, then we'll be back and continue our discussions on the subject of e-waste.
Eric Dankwa is 12 years. In spite of all these toxic fumes and gases in Agbogbloshie, is trying to make ends meet for his family. Agbogbloshie is a suburb in the Greater Accra region, where most of the electronic waste from the industrialized countries are dumped. Eric has to ignore being a child and take up responsibilities as an adult.
I've been doing this job
for 7 years now, and I feel good anytime I come here. I get money to buy anything I want, and I also give a part of it to my mother. Most of my brothers have gone home as a result of injury and sickness, and so they are afraid to come here again. Sometimes the burning copper explodes and burns our skins, so my friends hesitate in coming here. But as for me, I come here because my master is here to take care of me.
This is his daily routine, inhaling toxic fumes and gases since he turned 5, which puts him at a higher risk and reducing his lifespan. Eric's nickname is Dadia Please, literally meaning metal please. This is because he dares to go to the most dangerous places and search for metal scraps, which is also referred to as dirty gold. They are sometimes assaulted by their adult counterparts.
A lot of my friends go to steal somebody's goods, and when they come, they beat all of us mercilessly. Sometimes our masters intercede on our behalf by paying a token. But my friends who are drug addicts still go back and steal. So if you are unlucky and your master is not available, you have no choice but to endure the beatings once again.
Children as young as 5 watch the adult put their hands in toxic liquid and copy blindly. Few of his friends have fallen sick as a result. Others get deep cuts, sometimes resulting in deaths. Eric's friend Kwame has been hurt many times, and he shows us some of the scars on his body.
If we go for the TVs, we use rocks to break the glass, which gives us cuts.
So where are some of the scars?
Here.
What do you do when that happens? Do you take it to the hospital?
I buy medicine to treat it.
So you don't go to the hospital to be examined? Have you had a tetanus shot before?
Yes, please.
Karim narrowly escaped death in this dangerous work, which he says cannot be a job for little children like Eric.
In the year 2007.
In the year 2007, we went to dismantle a big metal in the bush, and we started loading it into a cargo truck. I was on top of the car packing the things when I started moving backwards with the metal.
So I don't know, say I reached on end of the car.
Not knowing, I was at the edge and realized I was falling, so I stretched to hold on to something in the truck, which gave me this car.
Catch my hand. So that's it. The reason why we stopped from my hand.
Many of these scrap dealers come from low-income earning communities in Ghana, compelling them to risk their health in their bid to improve their living conditions. Eric's reward for the hard day's job is less than $1. He dreams of a better life, but this might be influenced negatively as he continues to work at the Agbogbloshie scrapyard.
I want to be an accountant in my future. I want to save this money to pay my school fees so that in future I'll be my accountant.
It might even get worse. He may not live long enough to fulfill his dream. The metal police is ready for school, but because he's so tired most of the time, he often goes to school late. His performance in school can improve if his concentration is directed only on his studies and being a child. This is the only time of the day Eric gets to act like a normal child. After school, Eric hurries home, changes into his working gear, and heads to the scrapyard. Eric's mother, Rose, has to take care of 4 children, but she is unemployed and single.
God bears me witness. As for the money, it helps me. Sometimes he gives me some. Now I have waist pains as a result of my hawking. So sometimes I am unable to go the next day. He gives me 5 or 10 cedis. The work they are engaged in helps us all, but the school that he is unable to concentrate on is my worry. I have tried encouraging him to go to school, but because of the money he earns there, he plays the truant, and I cannot afford that kind of money. Eric, don't go.
I will go.
Eric, don't go.
I will go.
Eric is back to the Agbogbloshie scrapyard in search of money for the next day. Even in this difficult situation, the metal police is hopeful of the future. But as long as Eric has to earn money from the scrapyard to support his family, his dream of a better future hangs in the balance.
So we still have with us from Lancaster University, Dr. Andy Sweetman. And you watch that thing there. It means that beyond the subject of health is also that it provides livelihoods. So that's why you say it's a chain of an industry.
There is, yes.
Okay.
It's these issues are never straightforward, never simple. So, I mean, I'm a scientist, not a policymaker, but the intervention from a scientific point of view, as I say, is to try and reduce the risk of exposure, maybe the control of the movement of waste. But in the end, people are making some money by reclaiming and recycling. I have worked with a factory in the northwest of the UK, which looked at which actually produced secondary aluminium. So this aluminium is one of the commodities that has increased in value considerably over the last few years. And they are actually shipping aluminium drinks cans that have been scavenged from landfills in South America all the way up to the UK, stripping all the lacquer and the paint and then melting the aluminium to turn it back into aluminium blocks that can be then used in the automotive industry. So that is economically viable. It sounds slightly bizarre that you're shipping waste these large distances. So you could argue, well, should that stop? But of course the people that are scavenging, it's a very unpleasant life for them, but they are making some money. they are getting, you know, $1 or $2 a day.
So it's almost like a symbiotic relationship, so to speak.
It is.
Okay. Unlike the petroleum sector or the petrochemical sector, where waste are put in dams and perhaps come to docked along our shores, etc., and getting the needed permit for them to be environmentally friendly dumped. This is not kind of recycled at the point of exit in your country and then brought here. So they are brought in the form of used appliances, etc.
That's part of the challenge. You know, if you have a waste that's, I wouldn't say a pure waste, but you know, waste in a barrel.
Because really, it's not, yes.
You can stand somewhat. There is a chance then of maybe extracting, purifying, and maybe then ultimately maybe even reusing, which then of course reduces the amount that's going into a landfill or a waste site. The difficulty with many of these chemicals is they're incorporated into the fabric of the material itself, and it's almost impossible to extract it back out. Now, for the metals, you know, you can extract them, and in fact it's the metals that have the value. But for some of the chemicals I look at, it's almost impossible to extract them out. To give you an example of this, in Europe we are being pushed very hard to recycle plastic materials, so rather than going into landfill. And a leader in this is the automotive industry. So they're trying to, when a car's finished its useful life, they take all the plastic components off and they try to recycle. But one of the issues we have is that some of the chemicals that were added into the plastic, particularly these flame retardants, they are present in the plastic and they can't be extracted out. So what we're actually recycling plastic with banned chemicals within the plastic materials. And the analysis to understand what chemicals are in what plastics is extremely challenging and also very, very expensive. So it's a very complicated
I watched
picture.
a documentary on it from India.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I know that it's still also an issue in India too, but people also make livelihoods out of it.
Yes.
On the policy level, how are governments reacting to it, knowing that it's got scientific connotation, that's effects on the environment, on health, etc., based on the researches that people of your ilk tend to undertake?
So, for instance, going back to what I mentioned about the United Nations Stockholm Convention, once a chemical has been listed, and there are different levels of listings, so sort of degrees of whether a chemical is completely banned or has restrictions. So, for example, DDT, a very well-known organochlorine pesticide, that has effectively had a global ban, but then has small derogations that allow it to be continued to be used in certain regions of the world because it has a defined use. So it has a negative environmental impact, but a known positive influence on human health. But for these chemicals, we know that they are inherently hazardous and we need to minimise exposure. So and then it's then incumbent on all the signatory countries to ensure that we minimise the release of these chemicals into the global environment. What we haven't mentioned so far is that these are actually global pollutants. So we might have what we consider to be a very active hotspot around a recycling centre, say in Accra, and also the same in southern China. But these chemicals are actually pretty well everywhere in the globe. So if I was to take a soil sample in most countries, particularly in the northern hemisphere, I would find these chemicals present. And that's because they get out into the air, they can be transported long distances and find their way to very remote environments. You can find them in the Arctic. You know, you'd imagine that
in the
Arctic, so you'd imagine a very remote area. And that's because industrial activity, particularly in the northern hemisphere, so hotspots like Europe, parts of Asia, east coast of North America particularly, we're using these chemicals, they are getting out into the environment, not necessarily contaminating just our environment, but actually being transported long distances.
Right. Due to the fact that it's not become a worldwide problem, but a sectional problem for the world in identifiable areas, is that why it hasn't received the sort of recognition and perhaps also the emergency that needs to be attached to it? Like, let's say, issues of, is it gun running or issues of conflict and things like that?
I guess, you know, the way I look at the world in terms of the chemicals, I see it as a priority. But you can imagine in all of the other priorities, it's perhaps received less attention. So Under the Stockholm Convention, there is funding for all of the signatory countries for capacity building, so trying to understand within their own countries what the ongoing sources of these chemicals might be, looking at manufacturing, putting kind of inventories together. But the focus on all of that work has been on the obsolete pesticides, so things like DDT, some of the older pesticides. And so a lot of the money that's been available under the Global Environment Fund has focused on pesticide dumps. So there's many African countries where there are large storages, in poor storage sites for old pesticides. So money has been made available for those to be recovered. Again, these are contained, so they are in containers that can be shipped and incinerated. So these things are perhaps more manageable. When it comes to e-waste, because of the complexities, that is more difficult. But in time, I think that will get its recognition, and people will start to pay more attention to it.
We have them everywhere, and you indeed have acknowledged that. Appliances are in every country.
They are in every country.
Indeed, every country that wants to develop, one of the benchmarks, I guess, would be to have all these.
Indeed.
Okay. So then, how do we deal with this simultaneously? It is a problem, but it's also of good use, at least if you look at the beginning and the end use.
I think we have to look at the global trade of maybe obviously the primary market's going to be to the developed world, because the developed world has its insatiable appetite for the latest smartphone. But there is this then secondary market which has very little attention, and it's the secondary market of which of course there is a demand, but that's the market that produces the waste. And we need perhaps a link to go back to the primary market, or there has to be some responsibility for the primary market to look after the waste produced by the secondary market, because ultimately they were the ones they were the market that it was produced for in the first place.
Okay, ideally. That's why you're not a policy person.
But
I would ask you,
policy people would
how much money do you think that they need to be the secondary? But at the end of the day, it's the impact it has on human health, ultimately because of the other linkages like the pollution of sources of water, soil, plant, and things like that. I see that it is a hub in Accra, or it's an issue in Accra. And from the things that I have observed in the media concerning reportage on this, is usually based in cities. So does it become an issue of affecting agriculture and health of people?
If you have a hotspot of chemical contamination, as much as you might have in a landfill, that inevitably produces a certain sort of spread of chemical contamination.
But in a secluded area.
But in a reasonably secluded area. But we have seen that agricultural production in maybe a few kilometres away may still be affected. So one idea that we might be looking at for future work would be to once we understand the level of soil contamination within the site itself, is then to take samples on a transect from distance away from that site to see what is the influence. Because even if your chemical concentrations are lower, if they are accumulating in the food chain, people are consuming the food, that becomes another human exposure source. In a way that becomes more insidious, because we can see the defined hotspot, we can see the people working on the site having the direct exposure. Nobody would expect to have exposure consuming food produced 5-10 kilometres away. You just wouldn't, you wouldn't really think about it.
Right. No point has been made on that. How should governments be reacting on this? Governments in the countries that tend to have the effect.
I think that the story of the e-waste and government action has to be considered in the whole framework of solid waste. What we've just focused on e-waste, but Accra and many other cities have an enormous issue with solid waste, not just the electronic, but all the other, plastics and everything else. So I think what we have to look at is doing it we look at e-waste, but we look at it in the larger picture of solid waste. So for instance, if you're collecting solid waste, you try to remove and recycle as much material that can be recycled, particularly that has an economic value, and then you remove the electronic equipment, and that has to be dealt with separately, not put into landfill. Ultimately, that's what has to happen. you have to segregate all your waste. You try to minimise the amount that goes to landfill, because landfill is expensive, and just burying it in a hole in the ground is intuitively not the best. So you try to remove as much as possible. Some of the waste may have to be incinerated, and ultimately that's a way of, if you've got very toxic materials, then you might have to incinerate it. But there's also, there's a lot of other waste disposal methods. There's things like energy. You can now produce energy from. So if you separate the organic waste, you can then compost it. You can turn it into fuel. You can create electricity from it.
Definitely.
But so it's a matter of sort of building the whole infrastructure up on dealing with waste, and the e-waste, I think, will then just be part of that whole offering of controlling solid waste. This is enormously expensive.
Yeah. At the end of the day, when you undertake your research activities, how does it inform whatever actions that need to be undertaken in the more developed countries that do the manufacturing and don't suffer from the after effects?
My role as a scientist that's helping to advise the UK government and elsewhere is, so when chemicals are listed for reductions or for a ban, then you would expect, certainly in the areas which have enacted those bans and controls, that the environmental concentrations will start to reduce. And that's why I run a long-term air monitoring network for the UK. We monitor these chemicals, and we have to remember these things respond very slowly. So even if you were able to control the source of the chemical pollution now, you might not see a significant improvement or reduction in concentration for maybe 10 or 20 years. This is a long-term project. So this is what we have to try and monitor, the response of the environment globally to these controls. So there's a lot of debate about the Stockholm Convention. It's now over 10 years old. Can we demonstrate the effectiveness of the convention? Part of the effectiveness is more and more countries sign up to it, but perhaps the biggest impact is that we can then demonstrate these chemical concentrations reducing in the global environment. Right.
The manufacturers, do they know the end effect of the after use of their product? Are they warming up to the whole idea that really it's harming people's health and people's... The
chemical manufacturers are...
Not necessarily the chemical manufacturers, but the product manufacturers as well.
One of the issues we have is that the supply chains for producing, say, a smartphone are incredibly complicated and incredibly long.
Because you're saying people manufacture this part, and then it's assembled.
Exactly. So assembly is very much a global business. So one of the chemicals you might be interested in, like the flame retardants, they're incorporated into plastic pellets that are maybe manufactured possibly in the Far East. The whole thing is assembled, the plastic pellets are then turned into a case, and then the whole thing is then sold. So the retailers, the supply chain have to be engaged, but ultimately it's the chemical companies that produce the chemicals that go into the product at the beginning. Okay. And they are very active because they are part of the solution.
Like, for example, behind you, there's a gentleman. Okay, he's not a gentleman. He's a kid.
Yes.
There's a child there trying to dismantle something. And we know that the various parts have been manufactured somewhere, either in Malaysia or somewhere in India or Japan and things like that, assembled somewhere in China.
Yes.
Okay. So what happens? Who becomes responsible for what? Since it's not a centralized manufacturing activity.
Within Europe now, the ultimate responsibility does come back to the retailer. So if you buy a computer...
Why not the one who assembles, let's say, who will be the retailer? Let's just take Samsung.
It is often the shop that you buy it from. However, they will then go back up the supply chain for dismantling and recycling. Well, I think we have to remember all these things are driven by the economics. Years ago in the UK there was no economic driver for recycling plastic bags, plastic water bottle containers. Now, because it's more and more expensive to put your waste into a landfill, the cost has gone up sharply.
A spiral.
It's now economically viable to recycle the plastic. So all these things do come into play. But just going back to what I said about the chemical manufacturers, when a chemical is identified, say by the Stockholm Convention, as something that we want to try and reduce globally, the chemical manufacturers are then engaged on an active process of trying to produce a new chemical that has the same function that can go into a computer, but doesn't have the negative human health or environmental impacts. And this is a huge amount of effort that's going in to try and substitute the chemicals we now know to be a problem with those that are more benign, particularly to human health.
Okay, so let's take it, every place was developed like the UK or the rest of Europe or the United States, or let's say Japan. So what happens? Nobody buys e-waste again as much or as many times as they would. So what happens to others? I mean, just
if it was
that's just a fantasy world.
Yeah,
though.
if it was all self-contained, so we basically, you know, we manufacture goods, they're sold, they come back to the manufacturers, all these things can be recovered and recycled in environmentally sustainable ways. It can be done. It's just very expensive. And at the moment, the economics don't quite add up. So it's currently cheaper to ship your waste off to another country for somebody else to recycle.
Okay. So when are you leaving Ghana?
I'm leaving Ghana this evening, unfortunately.
Oh, this evening?
Yes.
Have you achieved what you came for?
I have achieved what I came for.
You've taken some of the samples?
So I've taken the samples. They're being shipped back to the UK today. Oh. And they will be analysed.
Containerized?
Yes.
Oh, you dug craters?
No, I mean, when I say samples, these are maybe a few grams of soil.
And if you say they are being shipped, you mean you're using the flight?
Yes. So they get sealed up in
cans,
in bags and cans.
In capsules, so
yeah,
to speak.
Encapsulated and then sent back to the UK. And then in a few months we will have the data.
Right.
And then hopefully through the Lancaster University campus in Ghana, we will arrange to maybe do some more investigation.
Right. Okay, so have a safe flight back to the UK.
Thank you very much.
The day I visit, I'll look up to you, so I see whether I can come and have some coffee.
That'd be very good.
Well, or some tea. You bring some tea.
But in the afternoon, we have to have tea, yes.
Yeah, not for me though. Tea in the afternoon. Thanks, Dr. Andy Sweetman. He is with the Lancaster University UK, but also works for the Department of the Environment for the UK. I don't know whether I mentioned the department very well, but they call them DEFRA, and also the UN Environment Program, and doing a lot of activities on organic micropollutant and subject of chemicals, their effect on the environment and things. He has been in Ghana for this very objective. He'll be leaving this evening, but we say thank you very much. We've been looking at the subject of electronic waste and its effects not only on health but also on the environment as well. And so we know that just around the world, not only in Africa but elsewhere in southern China and parts of Asia, the debate will still be continuing about the after effect of electronic waste. But right now, let me just run this by you. Well, they call it the Flight Center. Cheap airfare masters, they call themselves. And Flight Center is Ghana's leading travel agent, offering cheap airfare, domestic and international, honeymoon in Dubai, holiday packages. They're now whetting my appetite. Cruises, ski holidays, last-minute hotel deals, travel insurances, everything you can think about. So just get your flight ticket booked from Accra to London, Accra to Milan, Accra to Madrid, Spain for just $499 US. From Accra to Dubai, $562 US. Accra to New York, $955 US, and all this just excludes taxes. And if you know you want to get married, please plan a holiday in one of these destinations. And for the couple, this is sweet, $2,460 US, and the package includes a visa, return flight, 5 nights in a hotel, tours to the Dan Desert Safari with belly dancing. You know, you go to the Arab world, they'll be shaking all their bellies there, barbecue for you, there'll be a cruise marina dinner with a transfer, half-day city tour of Dubai. I've been there, sweet city. And you also be visiting the Burj Khalifa at the top. And so the Flight Center, the chief FM masters can be contacted on the following numbers: 0544-322-111 and 0544-322-114. And again, please know the terms and conditions apply. They always apply, don't they? And so